Good morning, everyone. Good late morning, and welcome to our transitional kindergarten workshop. Because we're doing 3 and 4-year-olds, I thought I'd bring in Dr. Silvia Ybarra. She's one of the authors of the EDI book. She specializes in our early childhood curriculum, our phonics, our phonemic awareness program. She's developed that, the Launch to Literacy program. So I wanted to have her share some of her expertise. We also have Trish, one of our top early childhood research specialist, who also writes a lot of the early childhood. And we call them lessons. I'm going to, apologize for using that term, but these are our experts in this area for DataWORKS. That being said, I want to preface or start this off with, we want this to be a collaboration piece. We're going to bring in our expertise of EDI, how we can engage students, what are some of the strategies we use to get an intentional teaching episode across to learners. And what would that look like with 3 and 4-year-olds? And then we'd like to merge that with your expertise of obviously being the administrators of preschools. How would this look like with your population, with your demographics? EDI has been a fluid pedagogy. We're practitioners and we're not afraid to allow our pedagogy to evolve. What works, what doesn't, what can we refine? It has evolved as we've gone through the years, and with different circumstances, we've modified to meet the needs of certain circumstances or demographics. Our first contract in Australia, we worked a lot in a lot of Indigenous communities. There was a lot of external circumstances with a lot of the schools. One of the biggest issues they faced was turnaround of teachers. How, that turnaround was very difficult. So, how can we make our lessons more accessible for first-year teachers that are there? How can we get them? We even wrote a little bit more of a script to our lessons, which we never really did before. And, language acquisition, nonverbal students. And we took a lot of the knowledge of what was being shared with us, and we brainstormed. We did a collective efficacy of how we could make that work. Okay, so you might hear us use the term lesson today. I train and work with people every day in classrooms, and we might call it lessons, but I know you like the term intentional teaching. That's what we mean by that. That being said, there's a movement now in California that we're very excited about. There's a big push for funding for preschool education. So we're seeing the opportunity that a lot of, especially lower socioeconomic populations, get to go to preschool schools. Coincidentally, I taught in kindergarten classes. That's foundation age, but I also worked with TK, preschool age teachers as well. And one of the feedback is it's a dramatic difference. We know exactly who's gone to our preschool program and who enters foundation year kindergarten with that support, with that extra stepping stone. They've just got one more, leg up or one more opportunity. So it's a very powerful time. One thing that we will talk about is language acquisition, just even oral language. How do we get these students to gain language? Because oral language transfers very quickly to comprehension and reading. If you have oral comprehension of oral language, then you can transfer that very quickly to when you're reading, I can decode this word. Oh, I already know what it means. So that being said, we'll start with Trish. Trish, she's been doing a lot of work on how a 3-year-old and 4-year-old brain retains information.
So when we talk about younger age learners, you're talking about 3 and 4-year-olds. We've been doing some research, and one of the big things is that these kids at this age, their brains are still developing. They're pretty much developing from 0 to 5. By 5, they're at maybe 80-90% capacity of their brain. And what's happening is creating those neurological structures and pathways. And these neurological pathways and structures, what they do is they connect their experiences to new information, to old information, and these students or these young learners are still developing these connections. And so it's really important for us to foster that brain development, we're going to have to spend more time with repetition with them because they are still connecting, making those connections with those pathways, with the information they have, the experience, and then the new knowledge. So we recommend repetition, and so they can commit that to memory. Otherwise, those connections can get lost if they don't get that repetition. Also, we recommend that when we do teach these students or teach young learners, we're introducing one or two new things at a time instead of multiple things, because again, they need to be able to retain this information, and because their brain development is still in development, we're going to have to only do like one or two things new every time. And we can do that through repetition, rehearsal, visual aids. These are all things that we can do to help foster the brain development. So that's kind of what we found so far, what we've discovered with younger age learners from like 3 to 4 years old.
Can I just give an example of how we would recommend we did that? So that for me was really an aha moment, was the difference in the development at that age. 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, their long-term memory is still developing. So it's limited. And that's why they're still, you don't tend to remember that much at age 3 or 4. So when we say repetitions and when we say attention, rehearsal, repetition, mnemonics, and through visual and auditory stimuli, we're really talking about our engagement norms that we shared with you. So that's why when I teach a lesson, it looks like this. Can everyone see identify characters? So here are all the strategies that I'm using. I can pre-pronounce. Okay, students, before we even read this learning objective, let's just look at this word. I'm going to read it first. Characters. Characters. Now try that with me. 1, 2, 3. Characters. Characters. Yeah, let's practice it. Characters. Again. Characters. Yes, that's how you read and pronounce that word. Well, let's try this. I'm going to read this learning objective, and I want you to track, and then you're going to read with me, and I'll chunk it for them. My turn. We will identify. Your turn. We will identify. My turn. Characters. Your turn. Characters. In a story. Your turn. In a story. Wow. Let's see if we can put this all together. My turn. I'm going to read the whole learning objective. We will identify characters in a story. Your turn. We will identify characters in a story. Read that again with me. We will identify characters in a story. Those are the rehearsals. We don't necessarily call them repetitions. We call them exposures. And that's just, in the learning objective, now that I've used that, we're going to talk about attention span and limited attention span that we have for these learning episodes. But that would be how I could do a learning objective. And I'll show you how we do concept development with the gestures. I taught this lesson today. And, I had a lot of students who had no English. They were English as a second language, Spanish speakers with no English. But I taught them, my turn, class. A character is a person, animal, or thing in a story. Your turn, class. A character is a person, animal, or thing in a story. Let me show you what that means. A character is a person because I'm a person. Or animal because animals have funny ears. Or thing in a story. Can you do that with me? A character is a person because you're a person, I'm a person. Or animal. Or thing in a story. Yes. Characters talk or do something. Read that. Characters talk or do something. Let me show you. Characters talk. See me talking? You're talking. That's what characters, or do something. So that's the mnemonics, the cognitive strategy. And then I'll give examples. One day, a little girl named Josie was crying. She's a character because she's a person. And she's crying. So that's a character because she's a person and she's doing something in a story. That's what we mean by doing the exposures for that age. They're getting multiple exposures of that language. And by the end, those students, even the one who couldn't speak any English, I told them, which one's a character? Is the dancing frog that talks a character? And I didn't know he didn't speak English when I was teaching him, by the way. Is the talking frog a character, or is the park that doesn't talk a character? And he said, pointed to the talking frog. And I'm like, oh, I didn't realize what was going on. I'm like, why is that a character? And he went like this. He showed me, oh, and he showed me this. And I was like, oh, I didn't know the circumstances. I don't know these students. And then I asked him, and then someone explained, oh, he's an EL. I'm like, oh, can you say character? He said, character. And he talks or does something. Character talks or does something. So that was the exposure, and that, what we had to do just to get that concept of character across. So that's when we say repetition, we talk about a rehearsal. We did this throughout the lesson. I'm echoing the students constantly. Repetition, mnemonics, and through visual and auditory stimuli.
Okay. Yeah, the next slide is attention span. At this age, experts pretty much recommend that 2 to 3 minutes per an age. So if you're talking about a 3-year-old, it's 6 to 9 minutes. If you're talking about a 4-year-old, it's 8 to 12 minutes. So that's just to keep that. I'm sure you're aware of that. And so when you do present learning episodes or during morning activities, I'm sure you're aware that they need very limited attention span. And so you need to maximize their time and focus, have explicit, more directed learning episodes with the students.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I saw that today firsthand with, when I say kindergarten, I'm referring to foundation age 5-year-olds. Yeah, the first, I got them right in the morning, and I could stretch it to about 15, 18 minutes, but then I could see them, they were starting to wiggle on me. So we got up, we have to reboot them. And I would have liked them to do some other type of activity as opposed to going straight into another cognitive strategy. So we did a wiggle break for a few minutes, we danced, and then we showed them, because there was a couple sessions I wanted to show the teachers and the strategies. Oh, let's reboot, let's go back and let's see what we're doing. So being very conscious of these attention spans, I saw it firsthand all day today. I'm like, oh, and you see it and you know it as well. Knowing what we know about brain research for that particular age group, how can you ensure your students are getting the repetitions and exposures to the content? And we have to be very careful to only introduce, I introduced 2 things today, identify, and that was, but the most important was characters and identify. And that was my focus. So knowing what we know about repetitions and rehearsals, how would we get those repetitions and rehearsals and the mnemonic strategies and the visual and auditory stimuli? Why don't you take a second and pair share and be ready to share out? What do you think? And maybe your own experiences in the classroom. What works for your population and your demographics of students at your particular site? Okay, so take a second. Do we have individual teachers today? We're not paired up? Let's do a breakout group. I'll let you have 2 or 3 minutes and see what this means to you. All right, so what are some ways to support our students, or what are maybe some circumstances or specifics needs for your learners? So who can start us off? I'm going to randomly select someone. How about Jasmine? What are some ideas of what this research means to you for your 3 and 4-year-olds?
So for our 3 and 4-year-olds, they need lots of repetition. So just this page that you've got on now is really hit home of, being able to repeat what we're doing over a period of time. I was saying during our breakout session that a lot of our kids need a lot of modeling and even just exposure to text, because, some of them haven't been read to, or you can really see that they haven't been exposed to stories, and even just sat down looking at the pictures, so that print awareness as well. So yeah,
that was one. And one thing we collaborated, and that's pretty much our what we've developed, is when we teach a concept. For example, we would teach the most commonly used sounds, satkin. So if we taught the t sound to students that day, we'd give them an exposure, a learning episode, an intentional teaching on the t sound, and give them examples and see if they could hear it. And does top have the t sound? This cat, and I'm going to give you an example of what that looks like. But we also need to keep making connections to that. When we read a story, if we have our reading time on our mat, And anytime we come to a word with the t sound, we would emphasize, oh, look at this word, the tiger. The tiger in my story, tiger has the t sound. Oh, okay, and he played on the table. Oh, I see the t sound. You're making that connection. Look, one thing, you mentioned something really interesting to me, Jasmine, about, well, they haven't been exposed to a lot of books maybe or reading. That's kind of the premise of whole language. Whole language is you've been exposed to so much reading at such an early age, you start seeing a pattern and the kids can crack the code. The code of reading is phonics. The code is, every time I see that letter, it makes this sound. So now I see that. You're cracking the code with whole language, which I believe in a lot of exposures to reading. But with students who haven't gotten that exposure, we really strongly believe, give them the code. Hey, when you see that T, it makes the T sound. That's the code. So look at here, see that story? The tiger is making the T sound. So we want them to crack that code by giving them the code, okay? Oh, one thing, what we were talking about, I forgot. So we not only talk about the T sound in the books we're reading, when we do our play or transition groups, they get to, we call it here focus play. We do need a lot of play at that age. We do need to be active. It cannot be too overwhelming. Our brains are still developed. We need kinesthetic movement. But if we go play, intentional play, we would do it, oh, we're going to play at the kitchen today. What in the kitchen has the T sound? Oh, the table has the T sound. Even in the kitchen, I'm seeing the T sound. Oh, the tray has the T sound. So we make it, we use the word focus play so we can reinforce some of the sounds or some of the concepts we're exposing to those students. Okay, Trish.
Again, just further information about how their brain is developing and how I'm sure you're all aware how routines really help solidify and strengthen those brain connections. It helps the learners organize and process that information and make the connections. And then again, it also has added benefits of helps with student behavior, helps with engagement and focus, completing a task, staying on task, helping with confidence, making them excited for learning. I mean, these are all things that routines are just, they help, again, that's repetition, that they get familiar with that day, they get familiar with what's happening, they can commit that to their long-term memory. So these are just routines. I'm sure you all use them in your classrooms already, but how they just continue to strengthen that brain development, because that's what those kids are really doing at the age of 3 and 4, really trying to get those neural structures to make connections with old experiences and new experiences, and old experiences with new knowledge. And that will help continue to foster them. So when they get to kindy or they get to grade 1, they've made all those connections, and it's just getting them ready for school and school readiness. And this is just an example of what possibly your routine would look like. Everyone is always different. Like Joe was saying, during the arrival or the morning meeting, you might be focusing, if you're focusing on a book and that book, it has a particular sound, maybe when you do roll call or you just call out the kid that has that sound in their name, something like that, just to continue to foster and spiral those sounds that you're kind of focusing on or concept you're focusing on. So these are just an example of a routine and how it is important for brain development.
Even in this routine, again, I was in a, it's so interesting, the coincidence, I taught kindergartners today. Tomorrow I'm going to actually do a TK class. I wish I could have done it today to share that. And I teach kindergartners once a month, but I always lose sleep the night before. I lose sleep the night before I teach a kindergarten class because it's very unpredictable. And the only way it can work, and I'm very clear with the principal, if they really want me to do a lesson demonstration, is the students need to understand the expectations of the engagement norms. We can work with them, so we tell them why and how we use them. And they were 5-year-olds, but they understood the engagement. They knew who their pair share partners, their desks were labeled. One class had an ice cream sticker and a sprinkle sticker. So when the student sat, he was ice cream, share with sprinkles. Sprinkles, share with ice cream. Just to know that they knew how to use their little whiteboards, and we used red dot, green dots. And it facilitated the delivery. But when I talked to the teacher, I'm like, how did you get your students so well trained? They're like, look, we work on this routine of the engagement norms and expectations a lot. It takes a lot of time. We always discuss, this is what we do, and these are our expectations. So it's that practice and rehearsal again, and that exposure that will facilitate the engagement norms, because when you'll see how these engagement norms are a huge part of our English language learning strategies, how we can support language, how we support language acquisition. And everything really starts with the engagement and how we get that. But that routine, I remember one teacher, she would do 3 minutes every morning just reading that engagement norm poster. This is what we do when we print out with me. This is how you trap with me, read with me. So that was part of it, and labeling the little squares and things like that. Okay, next page, Trish.
And then also what is great for all students is a mind break, a brain break. This is just break time for the students. It helps get them back on track, engages them. It helps with cognitive thinking, supports their focus and mood, helps self-regulate so they get back on task instead of being off task. It gets them physically active, gets the blood flowing, circulation going. So brain breaks are great for all students, but especially these ones. And we use like a spin time within our programs. We just come up with fun little activities like freeze dance or just stretching, or the teacher could do a couple things of yoga or just dancing around. But you can also use like Go Noodle, or I think it's Fit For something. Those are just examples of what some educators use in their classrooms with young learners. And it's also important because it just reduces the stress for the student too, or frustration that they may get from learning, especially when they are having difficulty with language and understanding the language. So it's good for that, just to reduce the stress and anxiety that those students may be having during the learning episode.
Also, I want to add to that. Obviously, this was the favorite part of our lessons today, is when we went to the spin time and the kids got to choose an activity. But be strategic if you do have any learning episodes. Target them for early morning when they're freshest, and more kinesthetic type activities, play-based activities as the day goes on, as the brain fatigues. Because that's when, we have a few learning episodes a day, but not that many of them. And they're stronger in the morning. So if you are going to introduce a new concept, I recommend you think about doing it, fairly close from when they get there from school, and do a few, maybe one right after a break. And, a lot of the kinesthetics, and if you have these activities and other, play-based activities, do them as the day progresses, especially towards the later part of that day. How long do you have the 3 and 4-year-olds in the classroom or at the school? Can anyone answer that?
Yeah, so in most of our sites, we have children, so we run 2 groups in a week, and one group will come for 2 full days. So a full day for us is 8:30 to 3:15, or 8:30 to 3, something like that. And then we also do a half day, which is usually a 3-hour or 4-hour session as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure you already are aware that after lunch episode, that's a tough time for anyone, much less 3 and 4-year-olds. So think about anything that's more cognitively demanding earlier on in the day. Okay. We were sent the Early Years Learning Framework for Australia. And that's really kind of our expertise. We always ask, what would you like to teach a person or a learner? And here are some ways of doing it. And we can even tell us, here's why we would want to do it. Here's how. Here are the strategies that seem to be effective and work. But do we have to modify them? Sure we can. But this being the early years learning framework for Australia, it was kind of a little bit of an eye-opener for us. Okay, how would we direct some of this intentional teaching? Now, it gave us definitely some ideas and some suggestions we would make to you. Silvia, can you explain what this means to us and how it could direct us?
Yeah, that's our area of expertise, looking at all those documents and seeing to see how we can actually collaborate with our different school districts. And if you take a look at learning outcome number 5, it specifies what the numeracy and literacy should be at that age level. And it talks about the sounds of language, the letter to sound relationships. It talks about concept of prints, ensuring that we read aloud to the students, make the connections with all these sounds that they're learning, like Joe was actually going over. So there's quite a few areas in which we were able to find the learning episodes that we're talking about, in which we can definitely collaborate, the rhyming, the analyzing ways in which the students can ask and answer questions, and how to put together the sounds to make letters and to eventually make words. So what we would like to do is to share how we have developed some lessons, in which we're actually doing quite a few of those lessons here in California, with the beginning literacy and the beginning numeracy that your document is actually calling out that you do for that age level.
We don't share our opinion or view, but because it's still the expectations of what you're asking your learners to learn. But it's a framework and it's a guide to us. And what we do well is we look at that and we can think of how to maximize learning efficiency by placing it. We talked about the curve of forgetting, I believe, and what type of periodic review, what type of, there's a reason why we do fat pin sounds first, because those are the high leverage, most high usage sounds to get them reading quickly. So that being said, we do develop something that looks a little bit like this. We have looked at a framework, and what we do, I'm just showing you this, not for you to use, but so you can see the connections of how we try to expose our students. So on a day 6, we would practice the t sound. That would be the first day of a week, possibly. We would read words with the t sound in a learning episode. We would write uppercase and lowercase letters of the t sound to work on some high frequency words. Usually, working on motor skills. Usually our high frequency words, we would like it to be associated with words with the t sound, the T sound. School tools and vocabulary. We want to make as much connections and repetitions and associations is where we're going with this. If we have passages or teacher story time, we again want to make that connection. We want to get those rehearsals and the practices and the associations. We find that way it syncs it up, because we need those repetitions, we need those rehearsals, and we need those exposures. That being said, this is a learning episode of how it would look and how we would teach. This would be an intentional teaching of the t sound for our learners. Okay, I'll give you an example of that. Okay, it would look something like this. Now, we use the word practice in all our learning objectives when we're doing phonics. So the students are exposed to practice quite a bit. It might be the first time they see it. And if it is, I would just do one lesson on practice. It would be one learning episode. But again, practice is used in every learning objective. We just have a different sound. So they're exposed to academic language. But how we would teach academic vocabulary, I would do a separate lesson. It would look something like this. Class, let's look at this word. We read and pronounce it, practice. Your turn, practice. Read it again, practice. Wow. Okay, and this is a tricky one, because usually we have very short synonyms usually, but this we have a little bit more. Practice means to do something over and over again. Okay, when I say practice, you say do something over and over again. Ready? Let's try that. Practice, do something over and over again. Yes, again, practice, do something over and over again. Let me show you something. Practice, do something over and over again. See that? Practice, do something over and over again. Anytime I give my students a type of definition, I want to give them examples of that. Students, I can practice my letters because I want to draw the T, and I'll practice and I'll do it over and over again until I become really good at it. Students, I can practice kicking a ball because I want to be good at it. So I'll practice, I'll kick it over and over again. And here's when the teacher can use something that they've worked with their students with. What have you been practicing with your kids in your classroom? Students, we practice, blank all the time because we do it over and over again. That's what practice means. So that would be a learning episode, just that word, because like I said, it would be used throughout that learning objective. And then I could even have my students pair share with each other. What does practice mean? We're talking about some of the nonverbal. Look, we have to find a way to get these students talking. It's, I remember that was something that was a challenge in a lot of the remote schools I worked with. But the early ones, if we just were consistent and emphasize, we have, say the word practice, everyone practice. Again, do something over and over again. We had to get it out of them because we had to build that language. And so the students could start doing it. So tell your A partners, what does practice mean? Practice means to do something over and over. I mean, that's what it looked like. Sometimes, it depends on differentiation. I have some students who can, I can practice my counting because I want to be a good counter. I have different ability groups. How they will use that word would be an example, but that's how I would teach just that one academic word. Take a brain break, reset, then we would go into this learning objective. All right, class, what are we doing today? My turn, track with me, get your tracking fingers out. I want you to follow those words while I read. My turn, we will practice the t sound. Your turn, we will practice the t sound. You know what? Let's pronounce this. That's t. Everyone say that. T. Again, t. And then I'm going to emphasize that more in concept development. Again, I'll read it. We will practice the t sound. Your turn. We will practice the t sound. One more time. You know what? Who can read that for me? And now I start calling some random students. Oh, student 3, can you read that? And I go, Kylie, read that for me. We will practice the t sound. And then I'll repeat it. Yes, we will practice the t sound. Any volunteers? Okay, that's just my learning objective. Now I start speeding up. Let's say the name of the picture. I'll say this first. Tree, your turn. Tree, yeah. Tiger, your turn. Tiger. Look, students, you already use words with the t sound. Now we will practice the t sound. So here is where the teaching occurs. We follow the same pattern in concept development from pre-K to high school to adults. Anytime there's a definition, we give examples, possible non-examples in a higher order question. It's always the pattern. And it looks something like this. And then I think, are there any cognitive strategies, any mnemonics, any gestures I can put in place? So it looks something like this. Track with me. Words are made of sounds. Your turn. Words are made of sounds. You know how I remember that? Everyone show me a book. Or, I was refining this gesture. Words, everyone say a word. Words are made of sounds. Your turn. Words are made of sound. See, tree is a word. Say tree. Tree is made up of sound. Did you hear that? Yeah. 10, that's a word. And it's made of sounds. I hear you. Tiger, that's a word and it's made of sounds. Oh. My turn. Some words have the t sound. Your turn. Some words have the t sound. This is the sound. Hear that? T. Your turn. And then I'll give them a place of articulation. To make the t sound, quickly tap your tongue on the roof of your mouth behind your teeth and blow. T. That's how you make it. Show them physical pronunciation. Show them what's happening physically. Look, this word tree. Let's segment. I don't know if you segment or if you do. Tree. Tree has the t sound. 10. N. 10 has the t sound. Tiger. Tiger. Tiger has the t sound. See, some words have the t sound, but not all words have the t sound. Look at this. Ball. Ball. That does not have the t sound. Let me see. All. Doesn't have the t sound. Pig. Pig. No, I don't need. Doesn't have the t sound. Not all words have the t sound. Can you hear the t sound? Now I check for understanding. Academic definitions, a lot of rehearsals, repetitions, gestures, mnemonics, physical pronunciation, visual examples, non-examples, and now we can make this even into a higher question. Do you hear the t sound in two? And if we teach them, oh, why? How do you know you hear the t sound in two? And of course, at that age, they don't know how to justify. So that was the focus on today, justifying higher order thinking. Is it because you hear the t sound or because you're just guessing? I give them a multiple choice. Oh, it's because and someone, because I'm guessing. No, because you hear the t sound. And you say that, oh, yes, I hear the t sound. And some students had the wrong answer. And then I'd go back to them after I called on a couple correct students. You still don't hear the t sound in two? Let's segment it. Ooh, can you hear the t sound? And if one thing young children, early childhood, 5 and 4-year-olds is they're stubborn. They don't want to change their answer. I'm like, do you hear it now? But we emphasize, I told the teachers, always emphasize, it's okay to change your answer. And they're like, do you hear the t sound in two? Yes, you do hear it. Okay, then we went here. Do you hear the t sound in sock? Sock. Show me with your whiteboard. So that's kind of the teaching episode. Those are the exposures. Those are the repetitions. Those are the visual and auditory exposures and the gestures and the sounds and the place of articulation so students can understand this concept and this intentional teaching. That's what it would look like. And then we can get them even to here where we keep practicing. Does that have the sound? Does this have the? Okay. All right. That is one of the sounds of language. And that's how we would teach a letter sound. We have that same kind of, we would call it a lesson in concepts of print. That's what we would suggest. That's how we would get them exposed to them. We really believe in this. We believe decades of research clearly demonstrate that for novices comprising virtually all students, direct explicit instruction is more effective and more efficient than partial guidance. Basically, we've read this as a group. Remember, we believe in giving the students the information or some understanding of the concept. So now when we take it into practice, they have an understanding. Now, when I read my story, we were looking for a book with the t sound. I think we talked about brown bear. There's a couple places where it has the t sound, but whatever book you could find that has the t sound to expose them, because now those students have a little bit of conceptual understanding of what I'm talking about.
All right, Joe, we're at about 30 minutes out.
30, yeah, and we're going to wrap up a little earlier than that. And I want some feedback from you. We'll do another breakout group. How are you using these early years learning frameworks for Australia? What does that mean to you?
And I would like to add a little bit here. And if you go to the next page, right there, those 6 sounds are some of the most important sounds to teach. We were able to get the students to start reading right away. So I just thought I would mention that because it's not only the sound of the letter T, but also all these sounds that will get the students to start at least getting that letter to sound correspondence right away.
I hope that wasn't out of context when I keep mentioning sat in. B's the S, the A, T-I-P-N sounds. Those are the most commonly used sounds. That's why we teach them first so they can start decoding sooner as opposed to sounds that they wouldn't use. And also, we're also conscious of the language, the second language, if we have any knowledge of it. You know, I know in some languages, some sounds aren't used. For Spanish, what are the sounds that aren't used?
We don't have silent sounds. We have a phonetic language. We learn to read with syllables. So there's quite a bit of difference as far as learning to read one language and the other. But the bottom line with the pre-K is that they're not going to learn the sounds really, really fast because of all the repetitions and all the going back and all the connections that we're making. But so the sounds have to be taught sequentially, and they have to be taught to the point that they can start recognizing some of the words and how they connect to the sounds.
So for us, and the reason we showed this is because when we see this, this is a little vague, begin to understand key literacy and numeracy concepts, sounds of language, letter sound relationship, this cued us to SAT PIN. That was, okay, we're gonna do these 6 sounds because we know that we feel they are the most commonly used ones. So let's make that a focus of those learning intentions we're gonna share. So again, we'll do a quick breakout group. What does the early years learning framework mean to you? And how can you use our lessons or our strategies to support your learners? And again, maybe you have a question. Maybe there's, what would this look like in your school or in your class? And we'll open it back up in about 3 minutes. I'll let you have a chance to share on that. We'll just start with anyone. How about RD?
So our group sort of talked about how obviously the preschool is very play-based. So we need to make sure that we're utilising our small group times really well, because that's the time where we get the children in a group and we can do that explicit learning. And as we've said before, have minimal attention span. So rather than having long group times, we need to have smaller, short times. And where EDI really helps is by having that clear lesson design. So making sure that the learning objectives are really specific. We do a lot of work around syllable and rhyme, but towards the end of the year, we start to move into the SAT PIN because that's what our receptions are learning about. So that's the school readiness. So I think for myself in the preschool, we're going to make sure that we have real specific learning objectives, because when we break up into our small groups, that'll be the best opportunity to really engage our children and get the most out of that lesson.
Mm-hmm. When you do have that opportunity, have it intentional and take advantage. Yes. Okay. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Let's see. How about Corey? What did you take from this framework? What does it mean to you and your site?
Yeah, that's good, because I was going to ask a question anyway. But basically, we were sort of saying that in our site, we do a bit of this sort of explicit direct instruction, but not to the extent that we've sort of seen today. So whilst we might repeat something once or get the children to repeat it with us once, it seems to be a lot more than what we're sort of doing at the moment. So taking some of those strategies along with what we already do, I think will be how we sort of get the most success out of it, I guess. But one of the questions I had, so are you familiar with like the Jolly Phonics program? So sorry, you go.
Yes.
So essentially they teach the individual sounds and they start with SAT PIN. The way that we've done it at our site is it's sort of on a 2-week-ish schedule for each sound. But I wanted to ask whether you would suggest it's more efficient to go through those SAT PIN sounds for longer first to teach those foundational sounds, or is it better to get those first sounds more succinct, or is it better to get more sounds overall? That would be my question, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I've seen the Jolly Phonics program. when we originally did have a contract with Australia and worked with them, they were Jolly Phonics and International. Or was it International? I can't remember the other one. But yeah, I think those letters are important because that's where you're going to build that reading foundation, because they can do a lot more with those letters for like word families, etc. Anything, and a lot of times even that letters in name. But I definitely would spend probably more time on those, because again, as opposed to going into more letters of the alphabet, again, their brain is still developing. You're still having to do that constant repetition, and it's not like if you're in first grade repetition, you are going to have them repeat it more than other ages. So I would definitely consider doing them a little bit longer, and then just kind of getting that foundation down. So when they do get into kindy or grade 1, they have that background. And then they'll, again, because if you continue to do these types of strategies, hopefully other districts start doing these types of strategies, and then they get exposed to those strategies in their other ages, and they're getting those repetitions for those grades. So then it just kind of keeps spiraling. It comes along for these learners.
Yeah, yeah, because I think the issue that we were facing was that we were trying to get through so many sounds in a year as opposed to getting the sounds done properly. So that answers that. Thank you.
Right, and their brain. I mean, again, it's still developing. I mean, adult brain is not developed till we're like 25 years of age, 100%, and I would say about 90% is about 6 and 7 years old. So even a 5-year-old is working at probably like an 80% capacity, and because again, it's like getting amnesia and you don't remember anything, and so you have to create all those new pathways to your experience. You have to re-experience things. You have to learn new things. That's what young kids are. They're just brand new brain learning, and so overloading them with too much new information. I mean, that's going to cause those connections to weaken and then be forgetful, and especially without repetition. So I would focus a little bit more on those high utility. And if you feel that your students are able to grasp it, and you feel like they can move forward, then move on to the next letter, like M, or again, another high utility letter that they could use, that you could teach.
Okay, thanks, Corey. Thanks, Trish. Yeah, I do know one thing. Do you work in association with, do you feed into the kindergarten or the foundation reception schools? Do you have a relationship with the reception or primary school that these preschool students are going to, Corey?
Depends on the school. But for our school, our preschool, we're located on the school site. And I think it was like 85% went to the school, but then other sites are lower. And then we also send children to other schools as well, as like private schools or other local schools.
And the reason I mention that is because, one thing I try to talk with my early childhood teachers, especially the preschool teachers, is we are just teaching them the norms of being in a classroom. What is that like? That social, this is the first time a lot of these students have been away from mom or dad or family or whatever, or they're in this setting. And the little exposure that they get of the engagement norms. And if we teach them a little bit of the justifying piece and the sounds, when they bring this to their next year, especially if they're doing the engagement norms in that year in foundation reception, it's just supporting those teachers, but also those students. Again, the principal I worked with was, she's like, it's completely obvious which ones went to a pre-K program here and which ones didn't. There's such a dramatic difference in that language, That being said, we do want to really think about this. And this is one of the things we are up against. is vocabulary and vocabulary development. And this is just oral. And what we found is, Trish, can you explain this since you did the research on it?
There were two, Hart and Reesley, they both did a study on economic backgrounds and vocabulary development, and they found that there's a vocabulary gap. Actually, it's like 30 million words. They've heard less than 30 million words as compared to their counter age that is in a middle class, higher income level. So this just kind of breaks down that in a low economic area, words per an hour that they'll hear or be able to understand is 616, 1,251, and then 2,153 for high income. So they're just being at home. These kids are, when you're in a higher income, probably have more, they may be more professional. So they're using constant vocabulary, conversating with their student, their children, telling them, oh, I'm folding laundry. This is how I fold laundry. I mean, you might be saying that when they're like just little babies and you're kind of bored yourself, so you're talking out loud, but there's constant conversation and discussion in the home. And in lower economic situations, that's not always the case because parents are working, parents aren't available. And so their vocabulary development is not there compared to someone of that same age in a higher level, economic level.
Sorry, has that number changed since technology has become more prevalent? Do you know?
The number of the 30 million or these numbers on the words per an hour?
I mean, either.
Oh, okay. I know that I don't think we've gotten anything because of COVID. I know that California has done a study on TK because they are the leading state of the leading state that is implementing this grade school for transitional kindergarten. And they did show that because of the pandemic and these kids were on virtual learning and computers and stuff, that their language did drop off, but they don't know if it's because they weren't in the classroom. You know, there's different variables in that regards. So that's they were going to continue that study because they're going to be studying it for the next couple of years, transitional kindergarten in California. Not sure about in other parts of the world. I'm assuming if it affected kids in the United States, I'm sure it affected kids in other portions of the world and their vocabulary development. That's the only thing I read so far about that transitional K and how whether electronics itself and being on the phone when you're a kid a lot, or just kind of watching YouTube, whether that's affecting kids. I'm not aware of that just yet, the information on that.
And we took quite a few classroom observations, and we're calling the dark side of technology. We're seeing too many kids just looking at their screens, and not because the screen is only a one-way message. It's just coming to you. You're not actually responding to it. So we're beginning to think that we need a lot more interaction with the students, at least the ones that we encounter most of our work that we do. And so our recommendation to teachers is this screen cannot really take place of the interaction of the teacher with the students.
And can you talk about how, we believe strongly we can only control our four walls. That's our classroom. We can't really impact external. I mean, obviously we can do community outreach, things and educate community. That's important if we have that luxury. But what can we do with our students that we have in our classroom, Silvia, to develop vocabulary? What are the strategies we put into place?
Yeah, since we have been working with our pre-kindergarten students, and those are students who really even miss quite a bit, even their brothers and sisters miss the 1.5 years because we had the COVID, and the students didn't even have any type of models to look with their own siblings. So it took a lot of time for us to teach, even for the students to turn to each other and to pair share. And then what we did in some of our lessons, we had to remove a lot of the words because he had too many words. So at the beginning, we were just even teaching them the vocabulary of the classroom, and again with the repetition. And we did it very structured day after day after day. And right now they're doing a lot better. We can actually teach those sounds a little faster, but it's going very slowly. But again, asking them to say their name, and then to have say somebody else's name, and then the day for of the week, the name of the week, the name of the principal, the name of the teacher, the name of, and we do that quite a bit in the morning as a kind of a warm-up. And then we can teach a sound for about maybe 15 to 20 minutes, and that's going a little too long. And then we come back, and after they take a little break, then we can probably go into a little bit of numeracy. But the structure, the repetition, and but I think what really helps them is a very structured program that you know how to get them to focus, get them to pay attention, get them to repeat, get them to say things, and that seems to really be helping them.
You know, because what we do need to provide is oral language. It's really, we have to increase their oral language, and we have to emphasize it, because if you read this last paragraph, oral language is huge for reading comprehension and for their reading skill, because when they finally do decode and read those words, if they already know the meanings of it, they have the comprehension. But if you decode a word and you don't know what it means, then you have to teach the vocabulary. And it's quite tricky to do that. So the exposure to language and to talking, and I mean, that's how you learn language, is by using language and speaking. So how can we get our students to talk? Tell your pair share partner, tell me, use anything that we can get out of them. It has to be such an emphasis, developing oral language. We hope we were able to share some of our strategies, how we develop them, how we put them together. We're very interested in first how that brain retains that information and what it would look like. And I know we're running short on time. I did wanted to bring it back very quickly just to show you this. You know, that's for our ELs, you know, that it might be EALs in South Australia. But if we have to use general principles of effective instruction. You know, we really believe in effective teaching instruction with a language focus. And how do we find that? What's most effective for ELs? Well, we have a teacher checklist of well-designed, well-delivered, teach both content and language, vocabulary development, but that's why the engagement norms are so important to us. Enunciate clearly, that's the pronoun strategy. Chunk word for pronunciation, that's another pronoun strategy. Pronounce words physically, the t makes the t sound. Backward syllabications for older students, but connect to known sound. These are all the engagement norms right here. Reading and writing. Read the sentence as the students track. At least they're hearing it orally too. And you make an elaboration. Every time I read a story, when I read a sentence in a story, the bear was sitting on a chair. I point to the picture. See that bear? It's on a chair sitting. Or, you know, I can make a lot of those associations I tend to do. Read whole words, read initial sounds, phonics rules, syllabic rules. So this is the language. So we would be using these strategies, and then vocabulary development. Concept definitions, that's that definition with multiple examples, checking for understanding. We attach labels to prior knowledge, clarify multiple meanings, synonyms. So those are those when I'm teaching and working with ELs are my language goals are in the back of my mind that are addressed, and I'm focusing on to develop that language, especially that oral language. All right, well, that's what we have to share with you today. We really hope there's something that will help your school sites and support your learners at your school sites. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and thank you, Silvia and Trish, for helping me out on this one. This is, you know how excited I get about pre-K and kindies and students like that, but so
Joe, our early years leader, Karen, who's in the room with me, would like to summarise and thank you.
All right. I'd just like to say that was very informative, and it's given us lots of different strategies, ideas, and affirms some of the things that we're already doing. So Joe, Trish and Silvia, I think covering the information on the brain structures and the pathways, and the importance of the repetition and the, that has an effect on the memory of these young children that we are working with. And the more exposures and repetition that we can do, multiple exposures, as you say, is so important in these young brains. And the information on the attention span, giving us a few strategies on how to re-engage, children to bring them back. Really resonates with us, the transfer of how we can use some of this information when we're doing, building on our Hegarty, our phonological awareness, our PASM that we do here as part of preschool. Looking at the sounds, the teachable moments in play, and the routines are so important. How you teach them, you model and you practice over and, for those children. And the engagement norms, how we can connect to them and simple ways of doing that. It was really important that you came back to the learning outcome of our early years framework and how you connected and showed how this explicit teaching routines can be built into our early years framework by practicing. It was really good to see how you do the learning objectives and how you can really work with, say, the tut sound where you give examples, the place of articulation and where that fits in, and also the sounds, the important sounds. I think that just highlights, if we were all doing that in a play base and intentional teaching, I think that's good, setting the children up for success when they go into our reception year. And definitely increase oral language supports the comprehension and reading that we're all trying to strive for. I think it was a great session, informative, and just affirms or builds some strategies and ideas that we can take away to embed in our preschools. So thank you, for the session.
Yeah.
Ros, have you got anything?
No, again, thank Jo. You continue to amaze me. I know how many sessions and different levels of schooling that you're doing just in one day and sometimes one night. But your ability to take the information we give you and transfer that to our context, and in particular the way you looked at the early years learning framework to visually show our leaders where this work connects and how EDI can support and enhance it. I just continue to admire your ability to do that and to really listen. So on behalf of all the early years leaders, thank you very much. And Jo, have a little nap because we see you again with the primary leaders in about half an hour.
All right, everyone. Jo, enjoy your break. I'll see you in 30 minutes, okay? All right, Ross. Jo, everyone's in. Ross, did you want to give us sort of an introduction as we begin this this last segment here?
Yeah, we just spent the last 90 minutes with Jo and Silvia and Trish, who I suspect is not in this session, and Joey running through what EDI can look like in a preschool setting. So it was very targeted to what it can look like for 3 or 4 year olds, and it was reinforcing a lot of what our early years leaders do. But what we picked out of it was that our early years leaders don't necessarily do enough explicitness with their sounds and the being clear about their learning objectives and looking for that transferability of teaching a sound beyond, say, Hegarty or phonological awareness type lesson. So it was very useful. And we planned this session with Jo to actually continue to reinforce your instructional leadership over the EDI space.
Okay, thanks, Ross. Well, I think it's the afternoon about now. It's definitely the afternoon over here in California, but good afternoon, everyone. So it was really interesting, really funny because Look, my expertise is in the classroom. I know how to deliver an EDI lesson. I can do the workshop. I understand the principles behind it. And so when Ross asked me to do pre-K, pre-kindergarten, you know, I've taught a couple pre-K classes and it was tough. You know, how do you keep those kids engaged? And we came up with a lot of strategies, what it looks like. And the first thing we look at is we look at the brain research. How does the brain retain information? What does it look like? What is a 3-year-old, 4-year-old brain? How's it processing information? And then what can we do to support that? And then the next thing I asked Ross, because first of all, it's play-based, is a lot of the strategies or the pedagogy is play-based. That's not my background or expertise, though I believe very strongly in it. That age, you need a lot of movement and play. But the next thing I asked Ross is, what do you want me to teach? Because that's what we can do. If you ask what you would like us to teach, we have strategies for that brain to retain it, information. And usually we don't ask what you want us to teach because we look at what we should be teaching based on the curriculum. So for that, they have an early framework, and that gave us ideas. These are the initial sounds. We need to talk about sat pin, and there was some concepts and goals of what should be taught. That being said, for primary school, we really think about, we always start with alignment. First, we're going to look at the brain research and why, but there's 4 really things. I'm thinking about alignment to standards. Okay. Are my teachers teaching year level content? At what year level are my teachers teaching at? They might be a very effective teacher and the students are engaged, but is it year level content? Because if it's not year level content, we're missing the mark. Okay, the students will be, so we have to be careful. So if you remember, we showed this earlier. What is effective instruction? What is EDI? Well, there are some key principles that we want our teachers to lead with. The first is we're checking for understanding in real time. Okay, we're doing formative assessments constantly. I'll start with that. So I do that with whiteboards, to see, is it a whole class error or is it individual student errors and how we can address it. We know it works with all grade levels and disciplines because how does the brain retain information? It needs rehearsals, it needs repetitions, it needs mnemonics, cognitive strategies, auditory and visual stimuli. How am I incorporating that from pre-K to foundation to year 3s to middle school to high school to adults? But let's look at number 3. Students learn concepts even if there are some sub-skill errors. We want to make sure that our teachers are teaching year level concepts, and we will address the sub-skills in a type of, maybe with a reading specialist, maybe with a supplementary program like a reading mastery or spelling mastery where you pull some students out. But a good example of this is when I have the year 3 students. Okay, if I have year 3 students, in year 3, the curriculum or the standard states on characters, students will tell me what a character is like by what they say and do in a story. That's the year 3 curriculum. It's written in that's the year 3 curriculum. So I have to make sure that's the concept my year 3 teachers are teaching to their year 3 students. And the pushback on occasion will be, well, my year 3s, some of them are reading at a year 1 level. Some of them are non-readers, they're not reading. How can we expose them? Well, we have to learn how to teach that concept and substitute the sub-skill. So what we recommend in foundation, the standard is students will identify characters in a story. Okay, a character is a person, animal, or thing in a story that talks or does something. Can you read a story? Why is that a character? And we're going to talk about justifying answers, higher order questions, and things like that as this moves on. But that's the standard, identifying characters. Just because my year threes might be reading at that level, they still need to be exposed to the concept of telling me what a character is like by what they say and do. So what we do is we substitute the reading passages. We'll substitute those reading passages to give them maybe a year one level book, but with the concept of describing characters by what they say and do. That's the beginning of characterization. The concept. That's why it's really important to make sure they're doing that. If you remember, even middle school students, one of the misconceptions of our lessons is, oh, wow, those are really easy problems. My kids can do that in seconds flat. They can give me the answer. The answer's 2, the answer's 4, the answer's 10, the answer's 15. No, we make the math easy because we want to take out the subskill. But to make this a year 7, a student tells me, for number 1, if they tell me the answer is 2, I have to be careful. I'm like, how would you solve that one-step equation? First of all, can you explain the process? And if they just say, well, I just know the answer is 2. Well, that's beautiful. But remember this, empty box plus 7 equals 9. Empty box, this is a foundation standard. That's missing numbers from a box, addition fact. So to make that year 7, it's how the students explain their thinking, their justifying. And that looks something like, look, students, I'll do the first one. X plus 7 equals 9. Your turn, read with me. X plus 7 equals 9. I have X. I need to isolate my variable X. To do that, I get rid of my constant plus 7. But I need an inverse operation to get rid of addition. So the inverse operation of addition is subtraction. It will undo addition. So to get rid of that constant, I need the inverse operation minus 7 to get rid of that plus 7. What I do to one side, I do to the other side to balance my equation. And then now I have an isolated variable X equals 2 because 9 minus 7 equals 2. That's the language and that's the procedural knowledge a student has to show me that they're doing year 7 work. Okay, and that's how we substitute the subskill. That being said, that's what we look at when we talk about alignment to standards. What are my teachers teaching? Because a student can only achieve as high as the material that they're exposed to. So if a year 3 student is only exposed to identifying characters, that's as high as he can get, is identifying characters. No, we can still teach him the concept, describe, tell me what a character is like by what they say and do. Okay, so first of all, there's a couple real things to really look at and really think about for your students, for your teachers and for your students. We're going to talk about this a little bit more, okay? All right, to get information from sensory memory into working memory, we do multimedia experiences. We have a lot of attention, we have a lot of rehearsal, we have mnemonics, and through visual and auditory stimuli, okay? And to get information from multimedia into working memory, that's how we get it into working memory. And from here, how do we get it into long-term memory? Well, we need complex task, higher order thinking, okay? So we always have our students doing higher order thinking or higher order questioning, justifying their answers. They have to justify their answers. They have to interpret their answers. What does it mean? How do you know? Explain your thinking, textual evidence. I was lucky to teach in a classroom today. I taught kindergartners and first graders today. My lesson demonstrated all day long, and I also worked with teachers and I co-teached with them to to implement these strategies. And the teachers really had those engagement norms really established. That's the key to implementation. Have your teachers internalize the engagement norms and then train their students properly. Once that is done, once that they have that really established, the next step of implementation is extending your students' knowledge with justifying and higher order questions. You need to start with kind of easier questions in the beginning, because when they pair share and when you check for understanding, the de-escalation gets a little tricky. So what I mean by that, today, these teachers had the engagement norms down and their students. So the students were all showing me, students, what's a character? And they would answer their teacher, a character is a person because I'm a person, or animal or thing in a story, and a character talks or does something. And the teachers were very excited with those answers. And they should be, okay? But that's the beginning. And then they want to move on. I'm like, no. Can you give me an example of a character now? And I would ask the students, and they're like, what? Yeah, give me an example of a character. Have you read a story with an example of a character? And we actually taught a story in Spanish. It was, Quique throws a party. Oh, Quique, we just read Quique throws a party. He's a squirrel, but he's throwing a party, so he's doing something that a person does. So he would be a character, right? Yes. That's the deep level we want. Those are the complex tasks, the justifying, and that was the big aha moment. Okay, so that was the delivery, but the key now, going back, was why do we have to teach at grade level, and how, again, do we pace it? We're going to go back to that page in a second, but what we have is the curve of forgetting. Okay, everyone read this with me. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Explicit direct instruction includes periodic review to prevent information loss. It's known as the curve of forgetting. So what researchers have found that on day 1, these students today, 95% of my students in 5 classrooms understood what a character was. I would say more, there was a lot of comprehension of what a character was. But unfortunately, if those same students come back tomorrow and on day 2, if there's not any rehearsal, you've lost over 70% of your information. Okay. And by day 7, if there's no rehearsal, they've lost over 85–90% of the information. And then by day 30, they've lost over 90 and 95% of the information. So what's important for our classrooms and our curriculum mapping is periodic review. If those same students, if for 10 minutes, we just cover the material for 10 minutes and refresh them. Remember what a character is? A character is a person, animal, or thing in a story, and it talks or does something. Look at this story. Here's a character. This is Quique throwing a party. He's the squirrel who throws a party, so he's doing something that a person does, and he's also talking to his other friends. That's why he's a character. In this story, who's the character and why? That quick refresher is so important. And on day 7, that quick refresher is so important to get those students back. If that 10 minutes is done on day 2, you get them over 90 to 95%. If on day 7, that refresher is done for 5 minutes, you get them over to 90, 95%. In 2 to 4 minutes on day 30, you get them over 2 to 4, you get them back to over 90, 95% retention. So to bring this full circle, the first thing teachers, even school and administrators think is, well, we have so much demand on our time. How do we teach all the curriculum that's asked of us by the Australian standards? And how do we put in this periodic review? It's hard enough to just teach one of these lessons every day. How do we get all this curriculum across? And it's overwhelming with a lot of teachers I talk to. Well, this is what your curriculum mapping has to look like. This is how you offset your curve of forgetting. So, the first thing is you have to understand curriculum. So we do have a resource for you, but we will show you how you can develop your own curriculum maps and why. So the first thing is if you look at your year threes, the first thing we look at is we look at standard alignment. So we've taken the Australian curriculum, we've looked at your curriculum, and obviously every state has different interpretations of it, but it does have to line back to the Australian curriculum. A few states, Western Australia, WA comes to mind, is cut and paste. It's very similar to what they're asked of. South Australia, I haven't looked at the actual South Australian curriculum, but it always comes back to the Australian curriculum. It has to be shown that you're aligned to the national curriculum. So the first thing is we look at the standards and we tell you, well, in English language arts and literacy, there are 31 standards. And out of the 31 standards, because standards can be very ambiguous and convoluted, to make them year level, we've created 89 learning objectives. Those are 89 out of that 31, okay? Now, what we found is not all standards are weighted equally. Some standards have higher leverage and higher bang for their buck. And that's the first thing we start thinking about to support teachers. Okay, let's start thinking of essential standards, and the essential standards are the ones we really want to think about mapping properly. Day 1, day 2, day 7, day 14, day 30. Okay, so here's the next step that we do. We look at all your standards, understand standard 1, understand that languages have different written and visual communication systems, different oral traditions, and different ways of constructing meaning. Okay, that is the standard. Our expertise is on creating learning objectives, learning intentions. We've been doing this for a long time, and we can write a teachable learning objective. We compared the meaning of signs and symbols in different cultures. We recognize that stories are used to share cultural traditions. So that's what they want your students, your threes, to learn. So that's teachable for them, and that can focus your learner and your teacher. We give you a note after initial lesson. These objectives will be embedded in lessons throughout the year. Okay, you'll see this throughout the year. It can be embedded. We don't have resources on lessons, so the teacher would need to do that. And then we also think about, well, what are you asking our students to learn? And then how are you assessing those students? And the way Australia assesses the teaching of the standards or schools is by NAPLAN. So then we'll look at NAPLAN, and we deconstructed NAPLAN and seen what standards are addressed. This standard is not represented in any questions of NAPLAN. So that gives us an idea how essential or universal this standard can be. It needs to be taught. It's going to be embedded in a lot of lessons. Whether I put it in a day 1, day 2, how much emphasis is going to give me, I'm going to think about, okay? The same is for this standard. Understand that successful cooperation with others depends on shared use of social conventions, including turn-taking patterns and forms of address that vary according to the degree of formality in social situations. Very convoluted, sometimes ambiguous. All they really want your year threes to do, follow rules of collaboration. It's usually embedded in classroom norms. That's usually embedded on how students interact in the classroom. Again, we would, if we had a resources, we'd lead you to it. Also, NAPLAN does not assess this particular standard. Okay. The next one, examine how evaluative language can be varied to be more or less forceful. Descriptive language. Describe how word choice, describe how word choice affects meaning. This is important for writers and for reading. So we have a lot of resources on how to teach it. We think it's a universal essential standard, though it might not be weighted or represented in NAPLAN, it's something that we would want to make sure we expose our students with. So this is how we start determining what standards have higher relevancy or are weighted more as opposed to others. This is a big determination that you have to make on site. Now here is a classic example of a high leverage universal standard. The standard is understand how different types of text vary in use of language choices, depending on their purpose and context. For example, tense and types of sentences. So these are all recognize the language features of narratives, procedures, reports, reviews, expositions. We do have 7-component EDI lessons that would show this. And then we also saw NAPLAN really weights this standard. 9 out of the 51 questions asked on NAPLAN will refer to this standard, okay? We would never tell a teacher to teach to the test or you're teaching to NAPLAN. It's very controversial. That's not our job and we don't share, that's not our opinion. Honestly, if I gave you my personal opinion is we test our students too much. I think we're giving them too much standardized testing. That's my personal opinion, but it hasn't been asked of me by any of the curriculum writers or by NAPLAN. But what I do strongly believe in is if my student is going to be assessed, what are they going to assess them on? And I want to expose them to that information so they have a chance to show me if they've learned it or not, okay? And so that being said, we also look at how NAPLAN will assess it. How do they ask? What type of questions do they ask to show that the students do? So we can kind of simulate that in the lessons we create. So that's what we look at. And we would say these are really essential universal standards. Again, year 3 standards to be successful. You see that again here. Understand that paragraphs are a key organizational feature of written text. Identify the structure of a paragraph. Writing. Yes, this is done on NAPLAN, writing one-on-one. This is essential. So we start identifying essential universal standards. We want to cover all standards of breadth, but we'll find a way of doing it. This is 3 out of 51. Is this one using different verb type? And so now we've gathered information as, okay, how am I going to pace my curriculum? How am I going to target my learners? So after we've gathered this information, spelling's very big for NAPLAN. So we have there's a lot of spelling that's asked, spelling conventions. So now where we take this, now we put this together for a teacher. This is what your curriculum leaders at your school sites. So some school sites have literacy specialists or numeracy specialists, where they take the curriculum. Well, this is how they should think about supporting teachers and putting this all together. What we now do is we write a curriculum map, or what we call in the States, a pacing calendar. Pacing calendar, the term can be controversial because it connotates we need to be on a pace. Now, I don't care what you call it. Just think of how you will place lessons so periodic review will be addressed. And that looks something like this. Okay, first, we give you lesson overview. For a term, we feel that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 12, 16 really high leverage essential concepts that need to be taught. That's 16 in term, okay? We can give you, and we haven't looked at NAPLAN for some time, but the 2016 NAPLAN Language Conventions Overview, the reading overview, the writing overview, and we can give you the NAPLAN analysis. And now here is how you offset that curve of forgetting. So you don't overwhelm teachers to just tell them teach everything, teach all the curriculum in the Australia standards. You support them by saying, let's decide what our essential standards and essential lessons will be. So now we can place them. And we do this. We literally get into our writing research department and we have a huge whiteboard and we just make a grid, a calendar of 5 days, 5 days, we do it. But we only do 4 days of instruction because there's always an off day for whatever reason. And how we do it, now we just start inserting our lessons. Okay, on day 1, we're going to teach describe character, setting, and plot. This is an essential universal standard, and we're going to finish it on day 2. So our teachers know to finish it, and this is about a 30-minute learning episode for year 3. Okay, on day 3, I'm also going to start a whole new lesson, and that's an essential standard. Use commas and quotation marks in dialogue, and it's finished on day 4. But let's go back to this lesson. Day 1, I started. Day 2, we finish it because it takes 2 learning episodes to get through 7 components of an EDI lesson to get from learning objective to true closure. And day 1 looks different than day 2. There's much more pace and release on day 2. But how do I offset that curve of forgetting? On day 7, we cue teachers to review this concept again. Describe characters, setting, and plot. That will offset that. Now the the teacher that wants to make this program their own, on day 1, they open up this lesson. This is an necessary lesson that they can just open up a 7 component, or they know we need to teach this concept on day 2. But then by day 7, they're looking at periodic review. Oh, now they're using their own stories. Oh, year 3s, we're reading Wombat Stew right now. Let's describe the characters. We've got that dingo. What's the dingo like? Oh, he's kind of sneaky, I haven't read that book. I love that book, but it's been a while. Wombat Stew. The dingo's a bit sneaky, maybe not the brightest, brightest character. Why? Because he's trying to eat this. But let's see, what do the other animals do? Let's just, they're little kind of real. They're going to try to trick them. Where's it taking place? Oh, it's taking place in this cave. And what's the plot? That's when we start going over it with our own stories. What do you think we're going to do or recommend the teacher does on day 14 or day 12 approximately? Periodic review 2. Describe characters, setting, and plot. Again, day 30 or day 17. Describe a periodic review 3 of describe characters, setting, and plot. And you should see it approximately again around that 30-day mark somewhere to offset the curve of forgetting. It'll be in there somewhere. Describe characters, setting, and plot. But we cue you how to offset. Again, this goes back to the curve of forgetting, how you offset it. Strategically placed periodic review. And then how do you keep the teachers from being overwhelmed? Well, let's look at the 16 essential standards or lessons you want them to learn, that you want them to learn this term, okay? You can decide as a team, whatever that is. So that's what it would look like. And that's what a curriculum map would look like. And that's what looking at the standards and deconstructing them into learning objectives would look like. So that's the first thing. Think about, what is our curriculum looking like and why? Are we aligned to the standards? What does that mean? And how are we offsetting the curve of forgetting? That'll be the first question I ask you. Next, we're going to see, are the lessons aligned to the actual standard? So this is the breadth of curriculum. Are you covering the standards? And then some might be weighted more than others, okay? We're going to do our first breakout group because I see we have a lot of individual teachers. So I'm going to break you up in groups so you can discuss with colleagues and have collective efficacy and discuss how you would offset the curve of forgetting. What would you do? What is a curriculum map? What is it, which we call a pacing calendar? What lessons would you put in there and why? Okay, that'll be our first breakout group, and I'll give you about 3 to 4 minutes to discuss. Then we'll come back to debrief that. So the first thing that we touched on was the breadth of standards. Are we covering what is asked of year 3 students to learn. And the way we determine or recommend leadership determine that is by looking at your national Australian standards or your state standards that should be aligned to the national Australian standards. So once you see that, and then even then, because there's a lot to cover, you might even start looking at, well, are there some standards that are more weighted, heavier, and have higher leverage than other standards? That's how we now need to think about offsetting the curve of forgetting. So what did you talk about? How do you offset that curve of forgetting? And what do the breadth of standards mean to you? And how do you address it? So I'll randomly select someone. How about we start with Danielle? Would you like to start us off on what was discussed?
Sure. Yeah, we talked with Thomas and Ange and their deputies, and we talked about how it's embedded in our systems where we might have a end of week review of the learning that we've done, but less, I guess, common that we would go back 30 days later and just whatever the in between, 15, 30 days, whatever it is, to actually go back and keep refreshing that. So that's some changing thinking for us.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the curve of forgetting, if you want long-term retention, it has to be addressed. We've been working with these schools, and just on day 2, it's really tough for teachers to see, but I've been in the classrooms this last month 2 to 3 times a week, and on the day we teach, we're seeing some high success. 95% of those students are understanding the concepts being taught. But when we come back on day 2, the teachers, when they start with the question, who remembers what a character was, or who remembers what a diagram was? And they're like, wow, those students really, no, it's there. It's in their long-term memory. They just can't seem to retrieve it. You need to refresh them. You need to put in that periodic review. So really think about that. Silvia, do you want to add anything to the alignment of standards? Oh, and by the way, let me introduce Dr. Silvia Ybarra. I forgot to introduce her. I'm going on my, a lot of caffeine and my last workshop of the day. It's been a full day, so I might be a little bit slow today. So I thought I'd bring in the heavy hitter, Dr. Silvia Ybarra, who actually wrote the book on EDI, and she develops a lot of these, our lessons and curriculum mapping and why we do this. So Silvia, what are your thoughts on alignment to standards, and how did you develop that pacing calendar for curriculum map?
Well, what we did is we collected student work for, I think now we have collected up to 1 million pieces of student work, because we're very interested in the quality of the work that has been given to the students. That's the beginning. So I'm going to teach you a mnemonic so you'll remember all these 4 processes so you can make your school the best school ever. The first one is alignment to standards. Let's go like this, is alignment to standards. We have to make sure that all our work aligns to standards. The other one is really the breadth of the standards. Let's go like this. And the breadth of the standard means that we're going to cover all the different strands that are required for us to teach. I used to be a physics teacher many moons ago, and I really never liked some of the stuff on electricity. I like when cars crash and quite a few other things. So now I couldn't do that, because if my curriculum requires that we teach all the standards, so let's go like this, is the breadth of the standards. The next one is time on task. Let's go like this, time on task. We have now visited 35,000 classrooms, and the time of task many times is quite a bit, meaning that we are doing a lot of activities, but we're really not focusing on that really learning that has to be covered with the standards. And the last one is, of course, instructional effectiveness. And we go like this. Let's go like that. Instructional effectiveness. So we have alignment to standards. Let's go like this. alignment to standards, the breadth of the standards, time on task, and instructional effectiveness. If we don't have alignment to standards, that's what
Sorry, Sylvia, we couldn't see the instructional effectiveness hand movement. Sorry.
we
Can
go
you
like
put your
this.
hands a little higher up? Yeah, higher up, Sylvia, so the camera sees.
Okay, maybe I should sit on my pillow. Let's go. In order for us to really get a very, very high leverage on a student achievement, we need to optimize 4 processes. One is alignment to standard. The other one is the breadth of the standards. Then the other one is time on task. And the last one is instructional effectiveness. What do I do as a teacher every single day that is going to optimize learning for all my kids? So Joe has been covering the breadth of the standards. We have to have a pacing calendar so we leverage the very, very high leverage lessons throughout the year. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about alignment to standards because we just completed a big project and we collected student work for 1 week for a whole district, for every single one of all the elementary schools, the high schools, and the middle schools. And we take a look at the student work because we're very interested in 5 different pieces. Whenever you look, if you're going to do a study like this, which I recommend that every single instructional leader, when we walk through our classrooms and we're trying to do instructional effectiveness, always ask the teachers to leave a piece of student work that they're teaching that day so we can analyze it, because we can all learn so much by looking at this. And the first thing that we have found is that we are trying to teach too much, way too much. And when we try to teach so much, the students are so overwhelmed. So one of the principles that we have is the standards should be deconstructed into learning objectives. And Joe has shared that with you, how we have taken all the standards from Australia. And I know that you have different standards in different areas, but the process is the same. You take a look at the standard and then we deconstruct it into learning objectives. And that's what Joe was saying. We have, how many standards, Joe? And we can
31 literacy standards, 89 learning objectives.
Okay, so that is
for year 3.
So what we have found is that in many of the work that we collect, like this is the work that we collect, this is something that we collected for a whole week. The standards that are given to us, this is what I'm teaching. No, actually, we are not teaching this. We are only teaching a learning objective of that standard. So it's important for teachers to know this because sometimes they feel so overwhelmed that the kids cannot learn the standard. No, they cannot learn the standard. We have to chunk it into teachable units that we call learning objectives. Or you might call it learning outcomes, Joe? Or what's the name?
Learning outcomes. And
learning outcomes.
Can you really explain very quickly how we deconstruct a standard? Let's look at this standard, but let's look at how many different concepts there are. And that's how, show how we create our learning objectives.
Okay, when you're taking a look at an objective, we have to be very cautious that we do not overextend our teaching so the teachers are frustrated and the students are frustrated. So when I look at this standard, I'm almost having a nervous breakdown because if I'm looking at it, I know that it's not doable. So we tell teachers, whenever we take a look at the standard, make sure that you deconstruct it into the learning objectives. Make sure that you have an academic vocabulary word. That's what we call the skill of the standard. Make sure that you have a concept. That means that that's the big idea of the lesson, and make sure that you have context. So if I take a look at this long standard here, we know that if I take a look at this one, it's telling us to use, but it's telling us to use the appendices, the timelines, maps, and charts. So this long convoluted standard was deconstructed into 1, 2, 3, 4 learning objectives. So when the teachers are teaching this, they find that now is something that is doable. And we can go into our, website, and we have done all the deconstruction of the learning objectives for some of the regions in Australia, because that's our area of real interest. So remember, a learning objective is deconstructed, is a teachable component that has a skill. In this case, the skill is use. It has a concept. In this case, the concept can be timelines. And it has a context. That means that we need to explain it. We need to explain it in the context of using text features. So that's how we take one long standard. We make it into teachable chunks that we call learning objectives. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to ask you to go ahead and.
Can I show one thing very quickly too, before we ask our checking for understanding? So this teacher looked at this standard. Okay, she looked at the standard, used knowledge of appendices, timelines, maps, and charts to locate information and gain meaning. Explain how to use how these features contribute to a text. So what she taught was, why are text features important? Text features are important because they can help you if you, this is the student work. Well, this is not calibrated or aligned to what is asked of the students. The students need to use a timeline or a map or a chart to explain the text features.
Yes, that's another issue that we have found, that the standards many times are misinterpreted. What are the standards are actually asking us to do? And it's not just asking a question, it's really teaching them. In this case, we have a lesson here in which we were showing the teacher, this is what something like this will look like. Should I open up the lesson, Joe?
Please.
Use text features to locate information. And now you have a lot of the vocabulary. And this is what we call content vocabulary. But we also have academic vocabulary, clarify, information, describe. Without these words, the students cannot do well on the test, because the academic vocabulary, which is attention, information, describe, clarify, is the language of many of the tests that the students have to take.
A really clear example that I always share is for kindergarten, foundation age, year ones, they're asked to identify characters in a story. So we really teach identify and characters. And we caution teachers, don't just have students find characters in a story, have them identify characters in a story. Because if identify is not used, students won't learn that word. But when they're asked a question on that standard, the question is not to find characters in a story. The question is, can you identify a character in this story? That's why we stay true to the academic language as well as the content vocabulary.
Anyway, extremely important to collect student work and to analyze it, because whenever we do a lot of our training with Australia, we are only looking at instructional effectiveness. We cannot forget the alignment to standards, the breadth of the standards, the time on task, because those are all the other areas that are going to be important for us to optimize learning for all kids throughout the whole day in all our schools. Let me share with you another piece of work we have collected. When we look at this type of work, you as an instructional leader, we have to make sure that the student work contains content and academic vocabulary. Many of the times, like Joe was saying, we're talking about identify, and what we find is we ask the kids to underline the characters or to box the characters. Now, what we should do, and if you take a look at some of the vocabulary that we use in our lessons, this is a lesson on use abstract nouns. And if you take a look at the steps that we have, we say determine the abstract noun. Determine is the academic vocabulary. We teach it in the context of the lesson, but right next to it, we put a little parenthesis underline. So if you go back and you take a look at the student work that we collected, instead of determine here, we have underline. So that means that our lessons are actually not addressing the academic vocabulary. So Joe can send you all these 10 principles that we have come up with that really tells you what to do when you're looking at student work. Look at the academic vocabulary, make sure that they're looking at the learning objectives, make sure that we're addressing the context. And another thing that we have here is place the abstract noun in the sentence. So we give them a way to place it here, to write. But then another thing that is extremely important is to ask the kids to read this sentence aloud, because many times what they find is the students are busy underlining, highlighting, but I guess we forget that what we are really trying to do is we're really trying to also address a lot of the literacy in the standards.
Silvia, I have a question for you.
Yes.
I wasn't part of this project, but I did remember an episode that happened. John comes out of his office and he has a crossword puzzle in his hand.
Yes.
And one of the teachers were describing it that this is for characteristics, like RL 2.3 or whatever it was. And he was very upset. Can you explain kind of like how some people will use this is hitting the standard, but really it's not, and how that word conflicts sometimes?
Well, according to the research, whenever students are learning something, information has to be given in the way that it is used. And that's the reason you're looking at here. Read this sentence aloud, determine, underline. So whenever we're presenting the students with this puzzle, that they're going to have to find these words that they have not seen before, or they're not very familiar with. In the first place, they're not presented in the way we read. The way we read is really from left to right, and that's how we look for words, and words have to be connected to something that is meaningful for students. So what we were recommending, and this was a science teacher, and as a science teacher, I can tell you that it's a very difficult thing to remember all these. Science is almost like a foreign language, because we don't go around using molecules or, all the atoms and elements. And so that was not the most appropriate time to use that type of word puzzle. And John was not upset. John was trying to determine how we actually can support learning for all the kids. So now I talk about looking at student work. Why don't you go ahead and talk to each other, and all the principles of looking at student work. I just touched on a few things. It's enough for you to have a little bit of conversation right now. And I'm not going to go over all 12 of different ones that we have because it would be overwhelming.
Can you go back and leave on the screen the example of the one with text features?
Okay.
Start the breakout groups for us, Joel.
Yes, sir. They're on their way. All right, Joe, we can see your screen. Go ahead.
Okay. Alignment to standards. What does that mean to you? How can you support your teachers? What is the material your teachers are teaching their students? Are there lessons aligned to the standards? Maybe there's questions, or maybe there's aha moments that occurred. We'll start with a non-volunteer.
We were discussing the fact that you were placing those academic language, the verbs, up front and center for the students, but also for the teachers. We thought that was very powerful and something that we definitely wanted to ensure that we were doing.
You know, can I just comment on that? Most of the times, the teacher will supplement that word to help their students. They're like, look, I want to support my students, and I know character is the thing. So instead of teaching them another word that's overwhelming, I just want them to find the characters. And they're doing it. It's altruistic, not the word I'm looking for, but it's to support their students. It's well-intentioned is the word I'm thinking. It's well-intentioned, the thought, let's find the character in the story. Problem is, identify the character in the story is the standard, and in our standardized test, it's very consistent to what they're asked. You will identify characters. How do you identify? Can you identify a character in this passage? Can you determine this meaning of this word with the context clues? That's the language they tend to ask. So if the students don't have exposure to that academic vocabulary, they're gonna, and they understand characters, it's almost more of a real, it's heartbreaking. It's like they understand characters, now they just can't show you that they do because they missed that one word identify. Thank you for that. I'm glad you saw that. Any questions? Anyone have any feedback that they saw or that they came up with or anything? Please let us know. Let's see. Kathy, anything you'd like to share that you discussed in your group?
We talked about just that fact that the standards are so big, and that if teachers don't have an understanding of all the things within that standard, the students are never going to have the opportunity to be able to learn it. And if we're not seeking in our assessment what we're teaching, then we're not going to be able to check for understanding that our students are actually achieving what we're intending to teach.
Yeah, and it's really frustrating those standards. Silvia mentioned science is a foreign language. Those standards can be a foreign language sometimes. What do they want our students to learn? I remember looking at a learning intention for a year 2. The teacher's learning intention was verbatim the standards. We will determine that whole convoluted paragraph. Like, that's what I want them to learn. I'm like, no, that's what they're telling you to teach them. You have to make it teachable, which was very frustrating for the teachers. Like, how, what do I know? So yeah, breaking it up into teachable episodes, learning objectives, intentions can really focus that lesson and focus the learner. It does need, like I said, 31 standards of literacy in ELA for year 3s, 89 learning objectives. Silvia, can you discuss time on task and what you saw very quickly? Because I do want to spend the rest of the time on instructional effectiveness and what that looks like in a couple different year levels.
When we talk about these 4 parts, alignment to standards, the breadth of the standards, time on task, and instructional effectiveness, everything has to be optimized at the same time. But sometimes something is compromised. So in example number 1 that we have here, we actually are optimizing time on task, but we are actually compromising alignment to standards. So not all the observations that we do, we're compromising time on task. However, on scenario number 2, we're actually optimizing alignment to standard, but we're compromising time on task. So I want you to take a look at the difference between 1 and 2, and why is it that when we're looking at this, this is a system that we're trying to teach instructional leaders, that when you're looking at optimizing in your schools, you have to optimize all these components all at once. So we are optimizing time on task, but now in here we are compromising time on task and alignment to standards. Can you all read number 1 and number 2?
And they know they can read it on mute or read it with me silently. Students are on task 95% of the time. Examination of assignments revealed that they are below grade level. That's what we mean. On task 95% of the time, so they're optimizing time on task. But they're compromised. They're teaching below grade level. So the alignment to standards is compromised. Number 2, students' assignments are on grade level. Teacher is always late to class. What are we seeing? Alignment to standards is optimized. Time on task is compromised. So those are some of the ways you sometimes see this. Optimized here. This is exciting, especially when we see a great instructional effectiveness. Students spend most of the time doing grade level work in analyzing figurative language. Teacher explains, questions, models, and guides the students so they can do independent work successfully. So there's an alignment to standards. This has been taught and taught and taught. What's compromised, if anything? Well, is she teaching all the standards, the breadth of standards? Remember? How much, whoa, she needs to, we need to think about, are we covering all the standards? And then even now we talk about essential standards. So that's how we show that sometimes some of these can be optimized, and then unfortunately others are compromised. You would want them all working at the same time for that, for the maximum efficiency of our learners. The last one is instructional effectiveness. And that is the percentage of use of effective lesson design components and lesson delivery strategies. Okay, so we talk about this. And this really, truthfully, this should really be the goal of the teachers. Writing curriculum is a different skill from delivery. Teaching curriculum, that's a different skill. Learning, understanding the standards, that's a different skill than instructional effectiveness. In fact, I have a research department that, I know how to do it, but that's not my strength. My strength is delivery, instructional effectiveness. The breadth of coverage of the standards, I'm more of an extrovert. I deliver lessons and I can teach teachers how, but aligning to standards and when we ask our teachers and we depend on them how to do all 3 of these, all 4, it's overwhelming. So you have to find a way to support them and give them the tools to be on grade level. So many teachers just like, look, I want to learn how to teach. Just, can you tell me what to teach or can you show me the material? I don't want to create the lesson. That's a different skill. So that's something you really need to think about. So instructional effectiveness, that's EDI delivery. There's 2 things we want to think about as leaders. The first, the feedback we give our teachers. The feedback is very specific. Provide criterion reference feedback based on predefined strategies. The teacher pre-reads difficult words, then she asks the students to read the words with her. Your pre-reading helps students read and pronounce the new words. Criteria reference feedback. Non-criteria reference, even though I like to include these, we need, the brain remembers any negative feedback. So we need to give a lot of positive feedback to help them support, but then we slip in one thing that we can do it. So we have to be careful. So we do, you did a nice job. I really liked your lesson. We give a lot of positive, but we want to, but eventually there will be some something constructive feedback for what they should work on. And that looks something like this. Don't nitpick. Don't focus on minutia. Provide feedback that makes the teacher a better teacher. Lesson had a high student success rate. You reached our goal of 80 to 100% student success, but be careful. I saw one student who wasn't paying attention. I would have used a different example. Today, I did a lesson demonstration, and one of the feedback, well, that little boy kept moving. He moved the whole time, and he was fidgeting, and he was doing this. And I'm like, look, every time I called on him, he had the correct answer. I can't control, you know why little boys move? It's because they're little boys. You know, a lot of them just move. They need to move. That's the way it looks like. I can't, you know, control that lesson, but I can see that he's learning it on task. So we have to be careful with that. That being said, here's how we put it all together. So we're going to go from the learning objective that's aligned to the standards, to activating prior knowledge, to concept development, teaching the definition, to teaching the skill. And it looks something like this. The teacher will teach this, track with me. We will determine or figure out the unit fraction of a whole. Read with me, class. We will determine the unit fraction of a whole. A's read to B's. We will determine the unit fraction of a whole. B's read to A's. We will determine the unit fraction of a whole. Couple non-volunteers. And you're not answering because I'm going to go through this quickly. Tammy, can you read to me the learning objective? We will determine the unit fraction of a whole. Beautiful. Angie, can you read to me the learning objective? We will determine the unit fraction of a whole. Any volunteers want to read to me the learning objective? Yes, how you read it? Ella, yes, we will determine the unit fraction of a whole. I'm echoing my students. We do this for efficiency. Look at what I've done here. Teacher read, students read, track with me, read with me. A's read to B's, B's read to A's, 2 non-volunteers, then a volunteer through. In about 30 seconds to a minute, the students can practice pronouncing with fluency the academic and content vocabulary they're going to be reading throughout that lesson. That's why we maximize it, okay? But I spent a lot of cognitive energy. These are year 3s. I've got a stopwatch in my brain going, I've got 20 to 25 minutes of attention span.
Can I say something here?
Mm-hmm.
The important part here is that the learning objective was not only for the teacher. The learning objective is, it has the academic vocabulary word, which is determined. It has the concept word, which is unit fraction. And the teacher is beginning to reduce the linguistic demands of the lesson by pre-reading this with the students. So the learning objective is to be shared with the students, just like Joe just did.
Okay, now we do activating prior knowledge. We are not assessing, we are showing. In math, numeracy, we call it sub-skill. So the teacher, if you see them numbered, the teacher will model the first example. Remember that curve of forgetting? In literacy, it's usually a universal experience. So the difference is in literacy, grandma asked Mary to grab a towel and sunscreen. Where do you think Mary is going with her grandma? I think she's going to the beach because she needs a towel, she needs sunscreen. Oh, she might be going to the pool. Oh, you know, how do you, well, yes. You just made an educated guess. When you read a passage, we call that an inference. That's universal experience. This is sub-skill. So I would teach the first one. Class, let's all read this together. How would you split a whole pie into 2 equal parts so that 2 people get the same amount? Okay, look, on your whiteboards, show me a whole pie. You show me a whole pie, and I would just cut it in half. See that? I have 1, 2, 2 equal parts. With your partners, draw a circle on your whiteboards, and how would you split a whole pie into 4 equal parts so that 4 people get the same amount? On your whiteboards, divide or split that pie into 4 equal parts. Show me your whiteboards. Why is that 4 equal parts? Oh, I see. What did you do? You did a line in the middle and then a cross, and you have how many equal parts? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, those are 4 equal parts. So class, now I make a connection. Class, you already know how to divide wholes into equal parts. But when we do that, when we divide wholes into equal parts, we call them unit fractions, one of those parts. You already know how to do this a little bit. And this is what the lesson would look like. Now I'm in concept development. I want to be here at about the 3 to 5 minute mark because this is the primacy recency. That's that really, this is when the brain can retain the most information. And This is what you want to have your teachers really thinking about. Everyone, remember this gesture. If you can, when we do concept, it's a definition. It's an academic definition. Everyone, please do that. Academic definition. Multiple examples. Students need to contextualize it. Non-examples, then a higher order question so you can differentiate. Okay, we ask a higher order question to our highest performing students. We de-escalate to our with the responses of our students. And this is what it looks like. And when I do it, I do one sentence or one definition at a time. I don't read all three of them. Think of this. Think of you being a year 3. A unit fraction represents one equal part of a whole. I promise you, a year 3 reading that for the first time will have no idea what that means. That's why we have to attach it to examples so they can be successful. So it would look something like this. Track with me, class, my turn. A unit fraction represents or shows one equal part of a whole. Read with me, class, 1, 2, 3. A unit fraction represents one equal part of a whole. What this means is if I have a whole, I did an academic definition, the examples is the key. If I have a whole, this circle's a whole, and I divided it into 4, how many parts do I have there? 1, 2, 3, 4. One of those parts is one equal part. That would be a whole. We're not telling teachers to use our examples. We're telling them to use any example. Look, class, you already did this. Look, you have a whole pie divided into 2 equal parts. You did. Now I have 1, 2 parts. One of those pieces of pie is a unit fraction. Look over here. You divided this pie into 4 equal parts. One of those pieces of pie would be a unit fraction. One of those 4 pieces. That's a unit fraction. Let's look at this word. Unit. Unit means one. Unicorn. That's one horn. That's how I remember one part. Unicycle. That means one wheel. That's how I remember one part. That's one equal part of a whole. But be very careful. If I divide a whole into 4 parts and they're not equal, 1, 2, 3, 4, do this. That is not a unit fraction. Okay, so that's the difference. They have to be equal parts. Academic definition, multiple examples, non-examples, then a higher order question. Now I can come over here. Which figure below shows a unit fraction? Explain. Is it figure A or is it figure B? Talk to your partners. On your whiteboard, write A and write B. Which figure would represent a unit fraction? Before you pair share, when you pair share, say the figure that shows a unit fraction is, and justify why. Okay? Talk to your partners. I want you to practice that complete sentence with the academic language in your complete sentence, in your pair share. Then here's how we differentiate. And I'm running out of time. I'm going to be a couple minutes past. I'm very sorry, but I just want to close with this effective teaching, how I differentiate. So I have David. If I can use you for some help here, I have Danielle and I have Natalia or Natalie. I'm sorry if I mispronounce it. David, you have a misconception. You put A, thumbs up for A. Can you put this up? Because I'm going to ask for whiteboard. So David, put up, this represents A. If you had a whiteboard, I know you don't have one, but your thumbs up shows me A. Natalie or Natalia, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing. You're my middle performing student. You have B. This is your whiteboard, but since you don't have it, you're showing me B. And Danielle, you're my high performing student. You also have B. Here's how we differentiate in EDI with one question. That's why it's so, we're based on higher order questioning, so all our students' needs can be met. David shows me he has a misconception. I will not call on him first. I will call on correct answers first, probably a middle performing student. So I'll ask Natalia to, instead of when people use whiteboards, they go to the wrong answers first. No, go to the correct ones if it's individual students. So I ask Natalie or Natalia, why did you say B is a figure that has a unit fraction? And when you answer, say, It shows a unit fraction because, go ahead, Natalie. And here, since we're running out of time, her response that I tend to hear is, it shows a unit fraction because all the parts are equal. Yes, can she justify? Yes, that's why. And I have de-escalation strategy. That's why this figure would show, and then I enter. Did you say that again? Oops. That's why this figure would show a unit fraction. Those are all equal parts. I'm echoing her answer for David's support, but I have to extend Danielle. Danielle, you also have B, but why is it not A? Oh, it's not a unit. It doesn't show a unit fraction because those are not equal parts. Those are, a unit fraction has to have equal parts. Yes, very nice. And so I could now go to David. David, would you like to change your answer and tell me why? Yes, I've made I understand now. I thought it was A because I saw 3 parts, but they need to be equal parts. But as instructional leaders, when you see this, now we can give our teachers feedback, okay? And the feedback looks something like this. Okay, we're using the track with me, read with me when you were doing the learning objective to support your students' reading fluency. Okay, and there was repetitions and rehearsals of it. There was a cognitive strategy. I didn't use the cognitive strategy as a gesture, but you did use a word morphology, a unicorn for one, a unicycle for one wheel. Okay, you had your students pair share, and when they pair shared a higher order question, but they practiced the academic language at the same time. Okay, you checked for understanding with whiteboards, and you let the students, you had them justify, so one student can self-correct, and then you always supported with complete sentences and with the academic vocabulary.
And that is what we mean by giving criterion reference feedback. If we train teachers with and we meaning the universal we, the engagement norms, when you visit the classrooms, and even though it's a 5-minute walkthrough, the feedback should relate back to the student engagement. Joe, I noticed that you presented a learning objective and you had the academic vocabulary word, and I noticed that you pre-read that with the students, and the students read it to each other, and then you checked for a non-volunteer, and then you were able to give feedback to the students. That is the feedback that is called criterion reference feedback.
I've now started showing videos that we filmed 15 years ago. We were talking about this morning. We're working at a school, and I'm like, we need to get new videos because, first of all, our pedagogy has evolved. It's been fluid. We've refined it. What works in the classroom? We are in the classroom all the time, and we talk about this really works. This is something that's supporting the learners. But anyway, if I showed an old video now, we could actually give feedback to me teaching it. I wasn't strong on the students didn't answer with academic language. There was a couple of things. It still was decent teaching, but there would be some criteria reference feedback I would give myself, and hopefully you could see to give your teachers as well. Anyway, we have a lot of information we wanted to share with you. The 4 keys: alignment to standard, breadth of standard, time on task, and instructional effectiveness. When we put those all together, we can really support and really make an impact of change at your school sites. Thank you very much for your time.
Joe, it's Ros here.
Yeah, thank you, Ros.
I'm certainly on cognitive overload because I've had, like you, 3 hours of the early years and then this, but this session just really resonated with me, having been in one of our high performing schools this morning, and asking questions about how do you know that there's enough rigor and enough stretch, and just what you were showing there I thought was quite illuminating for our leaders. But I'm not going to summarize. I've got the 2 chairs of both our Elizabeth and Hollywood Lakes and Garden partnerships that will briefly comment. Kath, do you want to go first, and then Rachel?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, Ros. Just to Joe and Joel and Silvia, thank you for your time today and just for investing in us as leaders, embarking on this really important work. I think some of the standout things for me today It's just that really important awareness that we could have the best teacher with the most engaged students, but if we're not hitting the mark with curriculum, we're doing a disservice to our kids. So obviously, I think for me, the standout stuff was that alignment to standards and really making standards teachable and teachers understanding how to teach them and then checking with students on how they've learnt them, because otherwise we're just doing a disservice to our kids by trying to help them. And I think Joe, you said it in a much nicer way, but sometimes we just dumb it down to help our kids, and what you're doing is giving us the opportunity to have those really high expectations so that our kids can show in all areas that how successful they can be.
Thanks, Kath. What about Rachel?
Yeah, I'll just add that. Thank you, Joe and Joel, and it was really nice to meet Silvia today as well. Thank you for your wise words and your time joining us. I guess you're preaching to the converted a bit with me about covering curriculum content. It came across really strongly though, and I think as a group of leaders, we really believe in that very strongly. Some of the new things to me that were really interesting today is I really liked the bit where you talked about memory retention and about that periodic review. I think that is something that we can really introduce to our teachers to, I don't think it's something that we necessarily are doing really well. I also thought that it came across really strongly to us about if we want that maximum productivity in our lessons and with our student learning, that we've got to have the balance of those 4 process goals. We've got to align to the standards, we've got to have that breadth of standard, time on task, and also that instructional effectiveness. You touched a little bit on classroom feedback and coaching. I was kind of hoping we had another hour and you could have gone a bit more into that, but thank you very much. Really interesting and lots of great ideas for us to take away. Thank you.
So thanks for that, Rachel and Kath. I think you summarised beautifully then. This is the last session that the LET team has arranged, and I know there's, I think, about 7 schools that are pursuing work with Joe. So I look forward to hearing about their journey. And for those, schools who are at a different stage, and I'm sure there has still been aspects that you can see that you can use that will lift the standard and quality of the teaching and the learning. So I can't thank you enough. It's amazing work you guys are doing over there at all hours of the day and night to be able to run these sessions virtually. And Joe, if you are coming to South Australia, I know there'll be many of our schools that will want to piggyback with pupil-free days and enable you to work with our teachers, which would be just fabulous. So on that note, if everyone can do a thumbs up for thanks very much. Thanks, everyone. Silvia, you were fabulous.
Oh.
I think you and Mr. Joe there complement each other very well, and I wonder why.
I'm a little nerdy.
The genes. That's where I got it from, Ross. Down the apple didn't fall too far from the tree.
No, but you've got that practical application, and it works really, really well. I think you've really hit the mark today. Just talking about this last session, I really think there's been new learning for every single leader, and I can't say how much I appreciate that.